The funniest part was that she called the cops herself. The sharp cry of a seagull echoed across the harbor as morning sunlight spilled across $6 million worth of polished docks, stainless steel railings, and gently rocking yachts. Salt air drifted in from the bay, mixing with the scent of fresh cedar planks that had been installed only a month earlier. I stood near the end of Pier 3 holding a travel mug of black coffee when I first saw Patricia Holloway marching toward the private entrance gate with nearly a dozen HOA residents behind her. Even from 100 feet away, I could recognize that determined expression. Patricia always walked like she believed every piece of ground in front of her already belonged to her. My name is Ethan Mercer. I own Mercer Yacht Club, one of the most exclusive waterfront properties on the coast. My family built it over 3 generations. Every dock, every piling, every boat slip, every security system, every clubhouse window overlooking the marina existed because someone in my family spent decades investing time, money, and effort into this place. That morning should have been peaceful. The water was calm enough to reflect the blue sky like glass. Expensive yachts sat quietly in their slips. A maintenance crew worked near the fuel dock replacing safety equipment. The entire harbor carried that relaxed atmosphere that only exists before the crowds arrive. Then Patricia decided to create a scene. I watched her stop at the gate where a large sign clearly read "Private Members Only." She glanced at the sign for less than a second before reaching for the latch. The gate remained locked. Patricia immediately turned toward the residents behind her and threw her hands into the air dramatically. Even from a distance, I could tell she was performing for an audience. Several homeowners nodded while others pulled out phones. One man already appeared to be recording. I took another sip of coffee and walked toward them. The wooden dock creaked softly beneath my shoes. Water tapped against pilings below. By the time I reached the gate, Patricia had already begun explaining why she believed the HOA deserved unrestricted access to the yacht club. The explanation changed slightly every time she told it, but the conclusion always remained the same. According to Patricia, because many homeowners could see the marina from their houses, they somehow deserved the right to use it. Logic had never been her strongest quality. "Open the gate," she said the moment I approached. No greeting, no introduction, no request, just a demand. I looked at her and then at the residents gathered behind her. Some appeared uncomfortable. Others looked curious. A few looked excited, as if they expected an argument. "Good morning, Patricia," I replied. "This is private property." Her smile vanished immediately. "That dock sits inside our community." "No," I said calmly. "It sits beside your community." Several residents exchanged glances. Patricia did not appreciate the distinction. She stepped closer to the gate and pointed toward the marina stretching behind me. Sunlight reflected off rows of luxury boats, creating flashes of white and silver across the water. "You cannot stop homeowners from accessing waterfront amenities," she declared loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Actually, I can," I said, "because I own them." The silence lasted only a second before Patricia laughed. It was the kind of laugh people use when they want others to think they are winning. "You really think you can keep an entire community out?" she asked. "Watch me." I expected frustration. I expected complaints. What I did not expect was how quickly Patricia escalated the situation. She pulled out her phone, raised it in front of everyone, and smiled with absolute confidence. "Fine," she announced. "If you refuse to cooperate, I will call the police." Several residents nodded approvingly. One even smirked. I simply leaned against the gate and watched her dial. Patricia seemed surprised that I made no effort to stop her. What she did not know was that I wanted her to make that call. Patricia held the phone to her ear with the confidence of someone who believed the next few minutes would end exactly the way she wanted. The residents behind her relaxed visibly. A few crossed their arms and smiled. One woman whispered something that caused several people to laugh. They were already imagining the outcome. In their version of the story, the stubborn yacht club owner would be forced to unlock the gate, apologize, and allow everyone inside. The problem was that their version had very little to do with reality. I stood quietly beside the entrance while a light breeze carried the smell of salt water across the marina. The polished hulls of luxury yachts reflected sunlight in every direction. Dock lines creaked softly against cleats. Somewhere farther down the harbor, a maintenance cart rolled across wooden planks with a low rumbling sound. Everything felt remarkably calm considering what Patricia was trying to create. "Yes," she said into the phone. "I need officers here immediately. A property owner is illegally preventing residents from accessing community waterfront facilities." I almost smiled. The statement contained more fiction than fact. The marina was not a community facility. The yacht club was not owned by the HOA. The docks were not public access areas. Every square foot beyond that gate belonged to Mercer Yacht Club. Yet Patricia spoke with such certainty that anyone overhearing the conversation might have believed her. When she finished the call, she lowered the phone and looked at me triumphantly. "They are on their way." "That was quick," I replied. "They understand the seriousness of the situation," she said. "I am sure they do." The homeowners seemed encouraged by her confidence. Several moved closer to the gate. One man pointed toward a row of slips where expensive boats sat motionless in the water. Another resident began talking about how much HOA dues contributed to the neighborhood. Listening to them was fascinating because none of their arguments involved ownership. They talked about proximity. They talked about visibility. They talked about expectations. Nobody talked about deeds, permits, investments, insurance policies, construction costs, or legal title. Ownership had somehow become secondary to desire. As we waited, my attention drifted toward the marina beyond the gate. The yacht club had always been more than a business to me. My grandfather started with a single dock and a small bait shop nearly 60 years earlier. My father expanded the marina through recessions, hurricanes, and years of unpredictable economic conditions. By the time ownership reached me, Mercer Yacht Club had become one of the most respected private marinas on the coast. Every improvement represented sacrifice. Every dock represented years of effort. People saw beautiful boats and waterfront views. I saw generations of work. Patricia interrupted my thoughts. "You know what your problem is?" she asked loudly. "You think money gives you the right to control people." A few residents nodded. I looked at her for a moment. "No," I answered. "Property ownership gives me the right to control access to my property." That response did not make her happy. Her expression hardened instantly. Before she could continue, the distant sound of approaching sirens floated across the harbor. Several residents straightened excitedly. Patricia folded her arms and smiled. The approaching vehicles turned into the yacht club access road and moved slowly toward the entrance gate. Sunlight flashed across their windshields. The residents looked relieved. Patricia looked victorious. I simply took another sip of coffee and watched the patrol vehicles approach, because unlike everyone else standing there that morning, I knew something they did not. The patrol vehicles rolled to a stop beside the yacht club entrance, their tires crunching softly against the gravel access lane. Almost immediately, the mood among the homeowners shifted. Confidence spread through the crowd like sunlight across the water. Patricia stood a little taller. Several residents exchanged satisfied smiles. One man actually gave me a sympathetic look, as if he believed I was about to learn a difficult lesson. The irony was almost entertaining. The marina behind me remained peaceful. Sunlight danced across the harbor. Flags fluttered gently from yacht sterns. The water carried the rhythmic sound of small waves tapping against dock pilings. Everything looked calm, but I could feel the tension building around the gate. Two officers stepped out of the lead vehicle and approached. Both wore professional expressions that revealed nothing. Patricia moved before they even reached us. She raised her hand and began speaking immediately. Her version of events came out fast and polished, as though she had rehearsed it beforehand. According to Patricia, local residents were being denied access to facilities that should belong to the community. According to Patricia, I was creating unnecessary conflict. According to Patricia, the yacht club was somehow preventing homeowners from enjoying waterfront resources they deserved to use. The officers listened politely. One took notes. The other occasionally glanced toward me. I remained quiet. Years of experience had taught me something important. People reveal far more when they believe nobody is challenging them. Patricia continued talking for several minutes. Every sentence made her sound more certain. Every sentence moved farther away from reality. The homeowners standing behind her nodded frequently. Some pointed toward the docks. Others gestured toward the clubhouse. Listening to them, you would have thought they had personally financed the construction of the entire marina. Eventually, one of the officers turned toward me. "Sir, would you like to explain your side?" he asked. I looked out across the harbor for a moment before answering. A white yacht was slowly departing from one of the outer slips, its engines humming softly across the bay. "There is not much to explain," I said. This is private property. The gate is closed because these individuals do not have access authorization. Patricia immediately interrupted. That is not true. The officer held up a hand. Ma'am, please let him finish. The interruption seemed to irritate her. She folded her arms and shook her head dramatically. I reached into my jacket and removed a small folder. Inside were property maps, ownership documents, permits, and access policies. Nothing complicated. Nothing unusual. Just paperwork. I handed the documents to the officer. He began reviewing them carefully while his partner walked toward the entrance sign. The second officer examined the posted notices, membership requirements, and property boundaries displayed beside the gate. The longer they looked, the quieter Patricia became. Not silent, but noticeably less confident. Facts have a way of slowing down people who rely on assumptions. The breeze strengthened slightly, carrying the scent of ocean water across the marina. Somewhere behind me, a sailboat bell chimed softly against its mast. The moment felt strangely familiar. I had seen situations like this many times before. People become convinced they are right because nobody has forced them to verify their beliefs. Then reality arrives in the form of documentation. One of the officers finished reviewing the folder and exchanged a glance with his partner. It lasted less than a second, but I noticed it immediately. Something had clicked into place. Something Patricia completely missed. She still believed the officers were moving closer to her position. In truth, the entire direction of the conversation had just begun to change. The officer continued studying the documents while the crowd waited for a decision that many of them believed was already made. The harbor remained calm behind me, almost indifferent to the growing tension at the gate. Sunlight reflected across rows of polished yachts. Flags snapped softly in the breeze. A pair of pelicans drifted low over the water before disappearing toward the outer channel. Everything about the marina felt steady and controlled. The only unstable element that morning was Patricia Holloway. At first, she tried to remain patient. Then she began filling every silence with explanations. She pointed toward the docks. She pointed toward the clubhouse. She pointed toward the waterfront homes visible beyond the trees. Her argument never changed. Because the residents lived nearby, she believed they deserved access. The problem was that entitlement and ownership are not the same thing. One of the officers finally closed the folder and handed it back to me. His expression remained professional. These documents appear very clear, he said. Patricia immediately stepped forward. Then you understand the situation? She asked eagerly. The officer looked at her for a moment. Yes, ma'am. I believe we do. For a brief second, relief crossed her face. Then the officer continued speaking. The yacht club is private property. The smiles among several residents disappeared instantly. Patricia blinked. Excuse me. The officer gestured toward the gate. The ownership records, permits, and property boundaries all indicate this facility is privately owned. Patricia shook her head. That cannot be right. The officer remained calm. According to the documentation, it is correct. The crowd grew noticeably quieter. A moment earlier, everyone had seemed eager to participate. Now they were listening much more carefully. Reality was beginning to interfere with assumptions. Patricia was not ready to surrender her position. There must be some mistake, she insisted. The community has been using this area for years. Usage does not determine ownership, the officer replied. Property records determine ownership. I watched several homeowners exchange uncertain looks. Some were hearing this distinction for the first time. Others appeared to realize they had never actually verified any of the claims they had accepted as fact. Patricia took another step toward the officers. Are you telling me residents have no right to enter? Without authorization from the property owner? Yes, ma'am. Her jaw tightened. I could almost hear the frustration building. The confidence she displayed earlier was beginning to crack. Yet she still believed she could force the outcome she wanted if she pushed hard enough. This is ridiculous, she said. We pay taxes. The statement hung in the air for a moment. The officer nodded politely. Most property owners do. A few residents lowered their eyes. Others stared at the marina beyond the gate as if seeing it differently for the first time. The officer beside him had remained mostly silent throughout the discussion. Now he looked from the paperwork to me and then back toward his partner. There was a subtle change in his expression. Recognition. Not surprise. Recognition. He had noticed something Patricia had completely overlooked. I saw it immediately. So did his partner. Neither officer said anything about it yet. They simply continued discussing the documentation and property boundaries. Patricia remained focused on proving access rights. She never noticed the small glance exchanged between the two officers. She never noticed the shift in their posture. Most importantly, she never noticed that the conversation was no longer centered on whether the yacht club belonged to me. That question had already been answered. A different realization was beginning to take shape, and within a few minutes, it was going to change the entire situation. The realization was spreading through the crowd, but it was happening unevenly. Some homeowners were already questioning everything they had been told. Others remained firmly behind Patricia, convinced that confidence alone could overcome documentation. Patricia herself seemed trapped somewhere between those two positions. She knew the conversation was no longer going the way she expected, yet she refused to accept that the outcome might already be decided. The breeze strengthened slightly, rippling the surface of the harbor. Sunlight flashed across chrome railings and polished yacht hulls. The marina looked like a postcard, which made the tension at the gate feel even more out of place. One of the officers stepped aside with his partner for a brief discussion. Their voices remained low, but their expressions told me enough. They had finished evaluating the property issue. Now they were confirming something else. Patricia noticed them talking and immediately interpreted it as a positive sign. "Good," she said loudly to the residents standing behind her. "They are figuring out how to handle this." A few people nodded. Others appeared less certain than before. The officer who had reviewed the paperwork returned first. "Ma'am," he said politely, "based on the documents provided, there is no indication that the Homeowners Association possesses ownership rights or access authority for this facility." Patricia crossed her arms. "Then we need to speak with someone higher up." The statement almost made me laugh. Not because it was unreasonable, but because of what she still did not know. "If necessary," the officer replied carefully, "additional review can certainly happen." Patricia pointed toward the marina. "This affects hundreds of residents. Someone needs to make a decision." The officer nodded. "A decision has been made regarding the ownership issue." That answer clearly frustrated her. She turned toward the residents as if searching for support. Several avoided eye contact. One elderly homeowner quietly stepped away from the group and began reading the property notice posted beside the gate. Another looked back toward the neighborhood, visibly uncomfortable. The certainty that had fueled the gathering earlier that morning was slowly evaporating. I remained silent. That was the part Patricia seemed to find most irritating. She wanted an argument. She wanted outrage. She wanted resistance. Instead, she kept running into calm answers and documented facts. The second officer finally approached the gate again. He glanced at me briefly before addressing his partner. "Everything checks out," he said. "Exactly as expected." Patricia immediately seized on the phrase. "Expected by who?" she demanded. The question lingered in the air for a moment. The officer looked toward me again. It was a small gesture. Most people missed it. I did not. Neither did his partner. Something was clearly being communicated without words. Patricia noticed the glance, but misunderstood its meaning entirely. She assumed they were looking at me because I was the subject of the complaint. In reality, they were looking at me for a very different reason. The sound of a yacht engine echoed faintly from the far side of the harbor. A vessel was preparing to leave its slip. Dock hands moved efficiently along the marina, continuing their work as though nothing unusual was happening. In many ways, they were right. For them, it was just another morning. For Patricia, however, the ground beneath her argument was beginning to disappear. She simply had not realized it yet. Then the younger officer took a step forward, looked directly at me, and opened his mouth to speak. The expression on Patricia's face suggested she expected a warning, a demand, or perhaps an order. What came next was something she never saw coming. The younger officer looked directly at me and spoke in the same calm professional tone he had used all morning. "Good to see you, Chief." The word landed like a stone dropped into still water. For a moment, nobody reacted. The breeze continued moving across the harbor. A sailboat bell chimed somewhere near the outer slips. Water lapped gently against the dock pilings. Yet among the group gathered at the gate, everything seemed to freeze. Patricia blinked. One homeowner frowned in confusion. Another looked from the officer to me and back again. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer. "Chief," Patricia repeated. The officer nodded naturally, as if there were nothing unusual about the exchange. "Yes, ma'am." The expression on Patricia's face changed immediately. It was not anger. It was not frustration. It was uncertainty. For the first time that morning, she looked genuinely unsure of what was happening. I set my coffee cup on a nearby post and folded my hands comfortably in front of me. There was never any reason to hide who I was. The subject simply had not come up. Patricia had spent so much time talking that she never bothered asking a basic question. The older officer glanced toward the residents. Chief Ethan Mercer has served as head of our department for several years. A murmur spread through the crowd. Several homeowners exchanged stunned looks. One woman lowered her phone. Another homeowner quietly whispered something to his wife. Patricia stared at me as though she were seeing me for the first time. "You are the police chief?" she asked. "Yes," I answered. Among other things, the harbor suddenly felt much quieter. Earlier, Patricia had spoken with absolute confidence because she believed she understood the balance of power. Now she was realizing she never understood the situation at all. The interesting part was that my position changed nothing about the ownership issue. The documents still mattered. The property records still mattered. The marina remained private property regardless of my occupation. Yet people react differently when assumptions collide with reality. Patricia looked toward the officers. "Why did nobody tell me?" The younger officer seemed surprised by the question. "You never asked." A few residents actually laughed. Not loudly, not mockingly, just the uncomfortable laughter that appears when people realize an embarrassing mistake has been made. Patricia clearly did not appreciate the reaction. She straightened her blazer and tried to recover control of the conversation. "That is completely irrelevant," she declared. "This is about property access." "Correct," the older officer replied. "And the property issue has already been resolved." That answer hit harder than the reveal itself. Until that moment, Patricia had convinced herself that discovering my role would somehow reopen the discussion. Instead, she was reminded that the facts remained exactly the same. The yacht club was private. The gate was private. Access required authorization. Nothing about that had changed. Several homeowners began drifting away from the entrance. Some looked embarrassed. Others appeared frustrated that they had spent their morning participating in a dispute based on assumptions. One elderly resident approached the property notice and read it carefully from top to bottom. Then he simply nodded and walked away. Patricia watched the crowd slowly losing interest in her argument. The shift was impossible to miss. Earlier, she had supporters. Now she had spectators. The difference mattered. Across the marina, sunlight sparkled across the water as another yacht eased out of its slip and headed toward open bay. The scene looked peaceful again. Yet I could tell this story was far from over. Patricia had just lost control of the narrative she created. What she had not lost yet was her determination to keep fighting. Patricia stood motionless for several seconds after the reveal, as though her mind was trying to reorganize every assumption she had made that morning. Around us, the atmosphere at the marina continued returning to normal. Dockhands resumed their work. A fuel delivery truck rolled slowly toward the service pier. Members of the yacht club walked along the waterfront carrying coffee and newspapers, largely unaware that the most dramatic event of the day was unfolding at the entrance gate. The contrast was almost surreal. Patricia had expected a public victory. Instead, she was standing in front of a growing audience that was beginning to question her judgment. "Why would a police chief own a yacht club?" she finally asked. The question caught several residents off guard. Even one of the officers looked puzzled. "Because he can," the older officer answered politely. A few homeowners laughed again. This time Patricia heard it. Her expression tightened immediately. She looked toward the group behind her, searching for support, but the energy had changed. Earlier they followed her lead without hesitation. Now many were studying the posted property notices, the ownership maps, and the documents that had already been reviewed. Facts were doing what arguments could not. They were changing minds. Patricia took a deep breath and shifted strategies. "This is not about you," she said, pointing toward me. "This is about the residents." I nodded. "Then let us talk about the residents." The statement seemed to surprise her. She had expected resistance. Instead, I opened the gate slightly and retrieved a framed property map from a display stand located just inside the entrance. The map showed every parcel surrounding the marina, including the yacht club boundaries, HOA property lines, public access roads, and waterfront easements. I carried it to the fence where everyone could see it. Sunlight reflected off the protective glass covering the document. "My family purchased this property 58 years ago," I said. The marina was built in phases over decades. The yacht club was privately financed. Every dock expansion was privately financed. Every maintenance project was privately financed. Several residents moved closer. Patricia remained silent. The Homeowners Association was created 21 years after the marina already existed. I continued. The community enjoys the view. The community benefits from nearby property values. But the community does not own the marina. One homeowner raised his hand. Has that always been the case? Yes, I answered. Every recorded deed says exactly the same thing. The question seemed innocent, but it carried enormous weight. Because if ownership had always been clear, then the misunderstanding had come from somewhere else. People slowly began connecting the dots. I could see it happening in real time. Patricia noticed it too. For the first time all morning, she stopped talking entirely. The younger officer stepped beside the map and pointed towards several highlighted property boundaries. These records match county filings, he explained. There is no discrepancy. That statement ended whatever uncertainty remained. A homeowner near the back shook his head and quietly walked away. Another followed him. Then another. The crowd was not angry. They simply realized the conflict had been built on a foundation that never existed. Patricia watched her audience shrink. The woman who had arrived expecting validation was now watching support disappear one person at a time. Yet even then, she was not ready to admit defeat. As she looked across the marina toward the private clubhouse and rows of luxury vessels beyond the gate, I could see a new calculation forming behind her eyes. The property argument was over. The ownership question was settled. But Patricia was already searching for another way to continue the fight. Patricia stared through the gate at the marina for several long seconds. The residents who remained were no longer gathered around her. Instead, they had spread out into small groups, quietly discussing what they had just learned. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. Earlier that morning, Patricia controlled the conversation. Now the facts were controlling it. The difference frustrated her more than any disagreement ever could. The officers remained nearby, relaxed and professional. Their work was essentially finished. The ownership question had been answered. The access question had been answered. The complaint that brought them to the yacht club had been resolved. Yet Patricia refused to let the moment end naturally. Even if you own the marina, she finally said, the residents still deserve some kind of access. The statement sounded less confident than her earlier declarations. It was no longer an argument based on ownership. It was an appeal based on preference. I leaned lightly against the gate and looked toward the harbor. The water sparkled beneath the late morning sun. Members were arriving for lunch at the clubhouse. Dock attendants moved efficiently between slips. The marina was functioning exactly as it was designed to function. Deserve according to what? I asked. Patricia hesitated. According to fairness. Several residents exchanged glances. One of them, a retired accountant named Walter, stepped forward. Patricia, he said carefully, did the association ever actually own any part of the marina? The question hit harder than he intended. Patricia looked toward him but did not answer immediately. That is not the point, she replied. Walter folded his arms. I think it is. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything the officers had said all morning. Because Walter was not challenging me. He was challenging the narrative that had fueled the entire dispute. More residents began asking questions. Had the HOA ever purchased dock space? No. Had the HOA contributed to construction? No. Had the HOA funded maintenance? No. Had the county records ever listed the property as community-owned? No. Each answer chipped away at assumptions that had existed for years. Patricia tried redirecting the conversation several times, but every path led back to the same reality. The yacht club belonged to the yacht club. The Homeowners Association belonged to the Homeowners Association. They were neighboring entities, not the same entity. The older officer checked his watch and prepared to leave. Before doing so, he addressed the remaining residents. If anyone has concerns about property ownership, county records are public information. You are welcome to review them. That simple statement carried enormous weight. Public records do not care about opinions. They simply exist. Several homeowners nodded. One woman quietly admitted she had never actually looked at the filings before. Another confessed she had always assumed the marina belonged to the community because people said it did. Listening to those conversations reminded me how easily assumptions become accepted as truth when nobody checks the facts. Patricia could feel control slipping away. Her audience had become investigators. Her supporters had become skeptics. The transformation was happening in real time. Eventually, she looked directly at me. For the first time all morning, there was no anger in her expression. Only frustration. "You could have told everyone this years ago," she said. I almost smiled. I did. Several homeowners laughed softly. Not because the situation was funny, but because they suddenly realized how many notices, meetings, documents, and explanations had been ignored. The realization spread through the group one person at a time. The conflict had never existed because information was hidden. The conflict existed because people preferred assumptions over verification. As the crowd continued shrinking and the officers prepared to depart, the marina returned to its normal rhythm. Yet one final consequence remained. Patricia had lost the argument. What she had not yet realized was that she was about to lose something much more important than that. By early afternoon, the crowd that had gathered at the yacht club entrance was almost gone. The patrol vehicles had departed. Most of the residents returned to their homes carrying a very different understanding of the situation than the one they had arrived with. The marina settled back into its normal rhythm. Dock attendants assisted arriving members. Boats moved in and out of slips. The restaurant inside the clubhouse began filling with lunch guests. If someone had arrived an hour later, they never would have guessed that a major confrontation had taken place at the gate. Patricia remained for a few minutes after everyone else started leaving. She stood near the entrance looking across the harbor, watching people go about their day. The determination that had fueled her all morning seemed exhausted. Eventually, she turned and walked back toward the community without saying another word. I watched her disappear beyond the parking area before returning to work. I assumed the matter was finished. In many ways, it was. Yet consequences have a way of continuing long after arguments end. Over the next several weeks, residents began reviewing documents they had ignored for years. County property records received more traffic than anyone could remember. Homeowners attended association meetings with questions instead of assumptions. They wanted explanations. They wanted clarity. Most importantly, they wanted facts. The narrative that Patricia had built over time started unraveling under scrutiny. Nobody discovered corruption. Nobody uncovered some dramatic secret. The truth was much simpler. Residents realized they had accepted claims without verification. Once they started checking records themselves, confidence in those claims disappeared quickly. Several months later, the association elected new leadership. Patricia was not removed in some dramatic public confrontation. There were no shouting matches, no scandals, no grand speeches. Residents simply chose a different direction. The process was quiet, professional, and surprisingly respectful. I heard about the outcome from one of the homeowners who occasionally kept his boat at the marina. His reaction summed everything up perfectly. People stopped following assumptions and started following facts, he told me. That was all the explanation necessary. One evening near the end of summer, I stood alone on the same dock where the entire conflict had begun. The air smelled of salt water and cedar. Orange sunlight stretched across the harbor. Reflections danced beneath hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of boats resting peacefully in their slips. The scene looked almost identical to the morning Patricia had arrived demanding access. Yet it felt completely different. Not because I had won. Not because she had lost. Those ideas never interested me. What mattered was that reality had survived the challenge. Ownership remained ownership. Property rights remained property rights. Facts remained facts. The marina existed because generations of my family accepted responsibility for building and maintaining it. Nothing about that changed simply because someone wanted a different outcome. As the sun drifted lower toward the horizon, a familiar yacht owner approached me along the dock. He was the same man who had watched the confrontation unfold months earlier. He stopped beside me and looked out across the water. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I should have checked the facts before taking sides." I smiled and shook his hand. Most people eventually do. He laughed softly and continued toward his boat. I remained at the end of the dock watching the last light fade across the harbor. The water grew darker. Harbor lights flickered on one by one. A calm silence settled over the marina. Standing there, I found myself thinking about a lesson my grandfather taught me years ago. People often mistake access for ownership. They mistake proximity for authority. They mistake confidence for truth. Eventually, reality corrects all three. The harbor before me was proof. The gate remained closed to unauthorized visitors. The yacht club remained private. The records remained unchanged. And as darkness settled across the water, so did something else. Justice had arrived exactly the way it usually does, quietly, patiently, and right on time.